Is it worth it to start a blog and maybe potentially a fitness blog like I have in 2026? Well, I don't actually know the answer to that question, but I think I have some good information about the current landscape. So for a little bit about myself, I'm Adam. I have been blogging as a fitness blogger since 2012. It has enabled me to create a lovely business that pays me a decent wage and has been doing so again since 2012 pretty consistently, which is lovely. And in many ways, I mean, this video is not sponsored by Squarespace, but it could be and it should be if Squarespace will, give me the opportunity because I am a Squarespace baby. I actually started back when Squarespace was, much, much smaller. And, my friend was like, hey, I've got this referral code for this new, place for building websites. And I said, sure. And I built a Squarespace website back in 2012, forever ago. It tells you how old I am. And, that was the start of everything. Since then, I have been using it consistently as a blog. There have been times when I focused on it, made it my full-time job. And in those times, I might blog 2 or 3 times a week consistently, writing mostly about fitness, but also just about general self-help, personal development stuff. And of course, I also offer online fitness coaching services, which is kind of my bread and butter, right? So this enabled me, in conjunction with my social media, to find clients. And of course, those clients pay me, and that enables me to continue doing the work, which is lovely. However, I do want to talk about some of the challenges that have started to come up in this sort of space. So in particular, I've had a few ups and downs myself. I would say that essentially a few years ago, I had an issue where I had to migrate my domain to a different domain. And that was a problem because it basically immediately killed my Google SEO stuff. Google really took some time to sort of relearn hey, this site has a bunch of cool stuff in it, etc. And it really took a year or two to start recovering from that. That said, I will also say that despite more effort from my end to, kind of keep it going, I have been seeing that views have decreased, that page views have decreased quite a bit in the last couple of years. Again, I started out in 2012. I had a few years where I wasn't really doing very much. Around 2016, 2015 is when I got a lot more serious about it. Around that time is when I started to see my readership increase significantly, started to develop an email list and all of that. And then that kind of peaked around 2020. I think obviously 2020 was, just a year where a lot more people were, sitting around at home, reading stuff on their phones, etc. And so I saw a really big jump in readership around then, and then it's kind of started to decrease, and basically the last couple of years it's gone down quite a bit, and again in conjunction with that issue that I had with my Google SEO stuff. Because of that, I've had to resort to using advertising a bit more to try and get people onto the site, which is itself not great. I mean, you don't like to necessarily have something that is 100% paid traffic, because it just means that people are not finding your stuff organically. It means that, you're paying to show it to people who might not have wanted to look at it anyway, and so those people are naturally lower value than somebody who sort of finds your site organically, reads it, and goes, oh yeah, this is the stuff for me. And that's kind of frustrating, right? Because this does represent at this point 13 years of work. Again, not necessarily always the best work, especially starting out in the beginning, but it does represent 13 years of work that I have put into this project. And, seeing that it just kind of has started going downhill after a certain point is not great. It's not fun. I think that this does rely on a few different factors. In particular, I think that the environment has just changed. I think that back in 2012, when I started writing a blog, a lot more people were willing to sit down and read a blog. That just was the case at the time. And back then also, it was a lot more aspirational. When I started out as a personal trainer, basically I had the sense that everybody and their mother was starting a blog. Everybody and their mother was trying to develop a following online. Social media was a lot more in its infancy than it is now. And so, of course, obviously, people were trying to do a bit of everything, right? It was like, okay, I'm trying to do blogging, I'm trying to do social media on this and that and this other site. And there was at the time also this sort of mentality that the blog was kind of a thing that was real, that was yours. Whereas social media was something that it was kind of like, okay, well, they could change the algorithm at any time, they could mess with stuff at any time, and that would mean that, you know, hey, maybe you have a bunch of followers on Facebook, but now they're never seeing your posts, so it doesn't matter. And, you know, the value of a Facebook follower is not necessarily very strong. And so there was this big emphasis on like, hey, you should get people to read your site. That's really how you connect with them. You should get people onto an email list. You should, you know, give them some kind of reason to sign up for your mailing list. And that was kind of the way that you would really get people into your ecosystem. And that was really the way that you would develop a business. And I think also it was considered a lot easier at the time. Like, I know so many people who had like honestly a kind of crap internet presence, and they would launch like a kind of crap, you know, product off of it, where it's like, hey, you know, here's like my workout program, it's like $50 or whatever. And people pay for that stuff a lot back then because, you know, it's just like that's what's available. And yeah, that was just kind of the ecosystem. That was the environment. And then, of course, there would be all these situations where then like one person who has a blog promotes another person, gets a lot of followers over to them. And it became this, you know, sort of cyclical thing. People could all sort of, you know, promote each other and they could all get sales. And so like you didn't even necessarily have to be necessarily a good blogger or a very, you know, popular one. You didn't necessarily have to, you know, be getting a lot of organic views yourself. You could just kind of, I don't want to say write anything and get money, but, you know, it was, I would say, a lot easier. The standards were a lot lower. What I have found in, you know, the last decade or so is that that's really no longer the case. A lot more people have blogs. There's a lot more good content on blogs out there. There are a lot more people fighting for eyeballs. And at the same time, not as many people are reading. Like, I'm going to be quite honest with you. The kind of attention that I used to get on my blog would be kind of across, you know, broad age ranges. Now, I literally do Facebook advertising, trying to promote this to younger folks, and they don't read it. Basically, the only people who read it are older folks. And that's fine. In general, I think that's okay for me and for my brand because, admittedly, I'm looking for clients who are willing to pay me on a consistent basis for fitness coaching, right? So for me, that's not necessarily going to be like 20-somethings just out of university or whatever who, you know, don't have any money. You know, the economy is not great as it is, especially for those folks. So even though I am trying to necessarily keep my brand, you know, focused on, you know, basically somewhat younger folks, I get so many, Christ, like, you know, you get like comments from like 70-year-old men, you know, that's basically what you get. And again, that's not the worst thing in the world, but it does give you a sense of how the environment is changing. Younger people are not sitting around and reading blogs anymore. And I think that's unfortunate because blogs are really a great source of information. They're really one of the few places on the internet where you can really have like a big, long argument about something. You can really write down like a, you know, big significant, like, hey, here's like a nice scientifically valid, you know, recent argument for something, whatever. You know, there's no limitations. You can put text in here. You can put video, photos, you know, whatever. You can put anything in here. Versus, you know, modern social media where everything is very limited. People are just fighting. You know, there's not necessarily a lot of quality, etc. But that said, I would say that most people probably don't need a blog nowadays. And I want to make that clear when I say you don't necessarily need a blog. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need a website of some kind. Because obviously you don't necessarily need to have a blog to have a website. And in general, a lot of people can do really well with essentially just a website where they sort of have like, you know, a bit of about themselves and then also some kind of a landing page. A landing page is basically just a page that says, you know, here's what I'm selling or here's what services I'm offering or whatever. And then, you know, it's nice and pretty and, you know, sales copy heavy or whatever. And then, you know, offers you the option to, you know, submit an application for services or buy a product or whatever, right? A lot of people can do just perfectly fine with basically just a landing page, a little bit about themselves, and then some other kind of social media presence to, generate traffic to push it towards that page, or being really good with ads and using ads to push traffic towards that page. Blogging, is really kind of content, a style of content that is maybe a bit behind the times nowadays. Obviously now there's so much more of an emphasis on social media, so much more people get so much more of their information from social media. And so you can really get good just being on social media. It used to be that wasn't really the case. It was like, hey, you make a blog or whatever, and then you use social media to try and funnel people to get eyes on that, right? Now, it's like you could really just get eyes on your social media, and then you could move that directly into sales to a much greater extent than I think was really previously possible. And you can kind of see this in, basically just my own development as well. Like, obviously I'm still blogging, but at this point, a lot of my updates to my blog are basically just reformatting, reworking older content that I don't like. And I don't make as much new content currently because A, I've said a lot of the stuff that I, really wanted to say. And B, I've just got a little bit tired of the format over, again, 13 years that I've been doing this. And so you can see that I personally have focused into moving a bit more into YouTube, which is a better space for me because it's still relatively long form. Unlike something like, TikTok or Instagram or whatever, where it's very, short form, very focused on grabbing attention quickly. Not necessarily my bag, not necessarily the kind of stuff that I always like to do. And so I've been trying to focus on developing YouTube. And while my YouTube is a very small YouTube page, it still shows, I would say at this point, a lot more promise than in general I would say that blogs do for me in the future. And that is sort of the crux of the situation, right? I think also that there is a lot to be said for how AI has changed the landscape. And I think that there's a lot to be said for how that in particular is probably responsible for a lot of the drop-off that I've seen in recent years. So obviously, the rise of LLMs and AI models has made it very easy for people to basically just scrape, all the content on the internet, all the written words on the internet, and, generate some, plausible garbage that kind of sounds correct, or, to just rapidly put out a lot of content, very quickly. And that has kind of, it's an arms race, right? It's kind of raised the bar or the expectations for how quickly people should be able to put out content. And to be fair, I have seen quite a few folks who've embraced this to just put out, a lot of slop. And the unfortunate reality of the situation is that that kind of slop will likely get a lot of clicks, get a lot of views, simply by nature of just being so much of it out there. And another problem is that Google has changed the way that they do things. It used to be that Google was basically one of the major ways that you could get views on a website. So basically somebody would Google a topic, they would say, hey, I want to know more about squatting or whatever the case is. And then, maybe you have an article that covers their exact question, and then they go, oh, I'm going to click on that article, and then, great, you've got a view, a page view. Nowadays, Google does this whole AI overview thing. So you'll say, hey, I want to know about squatting. And Google will say, okay, here's a bunch of information about squatting. Do you still want to click on all these links below this? And as much as I personally dislike AI and I try not to pay attention to those summaries, I will admit that there are times that I would Google something and I would click on a link, but then I, just see the summary and I go, okay, well, that's fine. That's probably right. Sure, whatever. And I'm not going to really dig deeper into it, right? And so this is, I would say, a big shift that really cuts down on Google's usefulness for driving traffic to individual websites. Because it used to be that maybe you'd search for something and you'd click around on 3 or 4 websites hoping to find sort of the answer that you wanted. And then you'd kind of go, okay, I think I kind of know the answer. Well, now, again, Google just kind of gives you the answer in the very beginning, and you don't necessarily have to even click on any of the sites or, do any sort of, thinking or, mental effort whatsoever, which is not good. But it gives you a sense of, I think that AI is on its own, in addition to just sort of polluting the pool, it's also making it so that a lot of people who would probably use Google to find your site in the first place, and that would have in prior days, that would have been one of your biggest sources of people coming in, is now just gone, or not necessarily gone, but it's significantly reduced. And I think that that is the bigger issue going forwards. And I think that that is probably why blogging, in a general sense, is not going to be as resilient in the internet of the future. I think that it is a lot harder for, say, for example, like AI to give you like a summary of this YouTube video, for example, when you searching YouTube for, information about squats or what have you, right? I mean, maybe YouTube will do that in the future. Maybe like you'll type in like, hey, is it worth blogging in 2026? And YouTube will just give you an AI generated summary of my video or what have you. And then you won't even click on this video. And that sucks. Don't like that. Don't like thinking about that. But for the time being, that's not the case, right? For the time being, that is not the issue at hand. And so I do think that for the time being, it is more likely that other forms of making content are going to be more resilient to these changes that are happening in the environment, that are happening due to AI. And I think that there's going to be a lot more opportunity in essentially being a social media influencer / content creator. So realistically, I will probably need to focus a lot more on other stuff than my blog in the future. Do I think that it's worth it to start a blog yourself? I mean, maybe. I will say that blogging still works very well for particular niches that are very knowledge focused, right? When it comes to something like, I don't know, how to use Excel tips and tricks, whatever, very techie stuff, obviously it's generally going to be more useful to have a blog that has, good descriptions of things than it is to necessarily going to, want to look for the same thing on YouTube or TikTok or what have you. Different kinds of content will do well in different situations. However, I think that in particular, my niche, fitness, has mostly moved away from the kind of stuff that I would make. There is obviously a benefit to doing like the super high end, very, very nerdy stuff like Greg Nuckols does, where it's basically just really digging into the research and, really on the cutting edge of that. I'm not smart enough to do that. I'm not really, the kind of person for that kind of niche. And so I don't think that there's really a particular case for blogging for fitness, for sort of like the average person making the average content, at least for me. And that's because I know I've done it for so long and it's just not hitting anymore. It's just not doing the same. I think that there is a lot more opportunity in sort of just kind of creating a personal brand on social media, being a bit silly, being a bit fun, having a bit of fun with it, or, making video content or something along those lines. I think that those options are much more likely to sort of take off or to be, more future-proofed than blogging just in general, blogging for fitness is nowadays. I could be totally wrong, but again, I'm just speaking from personal experience. I'm speaking from 13 years now of personal experience, seeing the ups and downs, seeing the ins and outs of things. And yeah, I think blogs are to a certain extent on a decline. And I'm kind of sad about that because obviously, I personally come from an English degree background. I enjoy writing. I think writing is really one of my favorite parts. And it's kind of sad that I'm not really going to have the opportunity to keep writing in the future, or at least not in the same way, at least not getting the same kind of, traction out of it. But that is what it is. It's the future. You have to grow, you have to change, you have to evolve if you're going to stay relevant. And, I'm doing what I can. So that is all for today's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash the notification bell, comment down below. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you're starting a blog yourself and you want any guidance. I'm glad to help out. Hopefully, you can see success. And as always, I'll see you all next time.